The rusty key trembled in Sarah Chen's frozen fingers as she stood before her grandfather's forgotten cabin, nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies. With her 7-year-old daughter Maya shivering behind her and their last $20 spent on gas to get here, this crumbling house was their final hope. 3 days ago, her wealthy in-laws had thrown them out, claiming Sarah was unfit after her husband's death. They'd seized everything, the house, the cars, even Maya's college fund. But Grandpa Wong had always whispered stories about hidden treasures, tales Sarah dismissed as an old man's fantasies. Now, as she descended into the pitch-black basement with a dying flashlight, her beam caught something impossible. Steel vault doors built into the mountain itself. Behind them lay stacks of rare artwork, gold bars, and documents that revealed her grandfather wasn't the humble immigrant she remembered. He was a legendary art recovery specialist who'd spent decades tracking down Nazi-stolen masterpieces. The treasure was worth over $250 million, but as footsteps echoed above them, Sarah realized someone else knew about Grandpa's secret, who had been watching them, and how far would they go to claim this fortune. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she grabbed Maya's small hand and pressed them both against the cold basement wall. The footsteps upstairs moved deliberately, methodically, someone searching room by room. Maya's fever had broken that morning, but she was still weak, her breathing shallow in the thin mountain air. "Mama," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. "Shh, baby," Sarah breathed, clicking off the flashlight and plunging them into absolute darkness. The basement felt like a tomb, heavy with decades of secrets. Even in the blackness, she could sense the magnitude of what surrounded them. Paintings she'd glimpsed that belonged in museums, documents that could rewrite history books, and enough gold to solve every problem they'd ever face. The footsteps stopped directly above them. Sarah could hear floorboards creaking under someone's weight, then nothing. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Who else knew about this place? In the 3 years since Grandpa Wong's death, she'd never seen any sign that anyone else visited the cabin. The road leading here was barely passable, hidden behind overgrown pines and marked only by a faded wooden sign she'd almost missed. She'd only remembered the location because of childhood summers spent here, listening to Grandpa's stories while they fished in the nearby stream. Those stories had always seemed like folklore, tales of his younger days helping families recover stolen heirlooms after the war, of dangerous men who would kill for what he'd found, of treasures hidden where greedy hands could never reach them. She'd assumed he was spinning fantasies to entertain a little girl. Now she understood every word had been true. A door slammed upstairs, making Maya flinch. Sarah pulled her daughter closer, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat through her thin jacket. They had no winter clothes, no supplies, nothing but the hope that this forgotten place might offer shelter. She'd never imagined it would offer salvation. The beam of a different flashlight suddenly pierced through the basement stairs, sweeping back and forth across the upper steps. Sarah held her breath, pressing deeper into the shadows behind an old workbench. The person above them was coming down. In the scattered light, she caught another glimpse of the vault's contents. A painting she recognized from art history classes, something that should have been lost forever. Her grandfather's careful handwriting on yellowed documents, maps marking locations across Europe. This wasn't just a collection, it was a life's work, a mission that had consumed decades. The footsteps on the stairs were heavy, confident. Not someone exploring randomly, but someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. The light grew brighter, and Sarah realized they had seconds before discovery. She spotted a narrow gap between 2 storage units and guided Maya toward it, moving as silently as possible. The space was cramped, dusty, filled with spider webs that caught in their hair, but it offered concealment. Through a crack in the wood, Sarah watched a pair of expensive boots descend into view. The intruder moved with purpose, heading straight for the vault doors. In the reflected light, Sarah glimpsed a man's silhouette, tall, wearing a dark coat, carrying what looked like electronic equipment. He knew about the vault. He'd come prepared. Maya's breathing grew labored in the confined space, and Sarah feared her daughter might cough or make a sound. The fever medication had worn off hours ago, and they had no more. Maya needed medical attention, proper food, warmth. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Sarah, surrounded by unimaginable wealth while her daughter suffered. The man began working on the vault doors, his equipment humming softly. Sarah realized this was her chance. While he was distracted, she could get Maya out of the basement, maybe even out of the cabin entirely. But where would they go? Their car was nearly empty. They had no money, no destination, and now someone dangerous knew they were here. The ancient Ford pickup coughed and wheezed as Sarah navigated another hairpin turn, its headlights carving weak arcs through the mountain darkness. In the passenger seat, Emma slept fitfully, her small body curled under a threadbare blanket that smelled of the homeless shelter they'd fled 3 days ago. Every few minutes, a cough would rack her daughter's frame, and Sarah's knuckles would tighten on the steering wheel. "Almost there, baby," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure where there was any more. The GPS had lost signal 20 miles back, but muscle memory guided her up the winding road. She'd driven this route countless times as a child, bouncing in the back of Grandpa Joe's old Chevy while he told stories about the mountains and the secrets they kept. Now, 15 years after his death, she was returning to his cabin like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The headlights finally caught the familiar weathered sign, Hartwell Property. No trespassing. Sarah's chest tightened. She'd tried calling the property management company that handled Grandpa Joe's estate, but they'd gone out of business years ago. The cabin had been sitting, empty, forgotten by everyone except the county tax assessor. She parked beside the covered porch and cut the engine. The silence was absolute, except for Emma's labored breathing and the tick of cooling metal. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to summon the courage to face whatever waited inside. The eviction notice crinkled in her jacket pocket as she shifted, a paper reminder of how completely her world had collapsed. "Mummy!" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "We're here, sweetheart. Remember the cabin I told you about, where Mummy used to spend summers?" Emma nodded weakly, her fever-bright eyes reflecting the dashboard light. Sarah gathered her daughter in her arms, grabbing their single duffel bag from the truck bed. The porch steps groaned under their weight, and she fumbled for the spare key she prayed would still be hidden under the loose floorboard. Her fingers found the familiar metal shape, and relief flooded through her. Some things, at least, remained unchanged. The cabin's interior was a time capsule draped in dust and shadows. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across the stone fireplace, the hand-carved dining table, the collection of fishing rods still mounted on the wall. Everything exactly as she remembered, yet somehow smaller and more fragile than in her childhood memories. She settled Emma on the faded sofa and began the work of making the place habitable. The electricity had been shut off, but the old wood-burning stove still functioned. Within an hour she had a small fire crackling and had found enough blankets to create a makeshift bed for Emma near the warmth. As her daughter finally fell into peaceful sleep, Sarah allowed herself to truly absorb their situation. They had perhaps $300 left, no legal right to be here, and Emma's condition was worsening daily. The free clinic had prescribed antibiotics, but they were running low, and Sarah couldn't afford to refill the prescription. She wandered the cabin restlessly, her flashlight illuminating fragments of her grandfather's life. His reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table beside a half-finished crossword puzzle dated October 2008. His coffee mug waited in the sink, a ring of ancient residue marking where his final cup had evaporated. It was while searching for candles in the kitchen pantry that she noticed the basement door standing slightly ajar. She didn't remember it being open during her childhood visits. Grandpa Joe had always kept it locked, claiming the basement was too dangerous for children with its steep stairs and old mining equipment. The beam of her flashlight revealed wooden steps descending into darkness. A musty smell rose from below, tinged with something else she couldn't identify. Sarah hesitated, glancing back at Emma's sleeping form. The child seemed comfortable for the first time in days. The stairs creaked ominously as she descended. The basement was larger than she'd expected, extending well beyond the cabin's footprint. Her light swept across workbenches, shelves lined with mason jars, and what appeared to be an old chemistry set. But it was the far wall that made her breath catch. Metal filing cabinets lined the entire length of the basement, each drawer meticulously labeled with dates spanning decades. Above them, corkboards displayed photographs, newspaper clippings, and maps marked with red pins. Sarah stepped closer, her heart hammering as she recognized some of the faces in the photographs. Missing persons posters, dozens of them. A grandfather's handwriting covered index cards pinned beneath each photo, noting dates, locations, and cryptic observations. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled down one of the cards. A young woman's smiling face stared back at her from a decades-old missing person flyer, and below it, in Grandpa Joe's careful script, found safe August 15th, 1989. Family reunited, case closed. She pulled down another card, then another. Each told a similar story. People who had vanished, and somehow her grandfather had found them. The implications crashed over her like a cold wave. Either the man who had raised her with gentle hands and bedtime stories was something far more complex than she'd ever imagined, or she'd stumbled into someone else's obsession entirely. The basement door groaned on its hinges as Sarah descended into the musty darkness, Emma's weight shifting in her arms. The flashlight beam cut through layers of dust motes that danced like ghosts in the stale air. What she'd expected to find were the usual remnants of an old man's life, forgotten Christmas decorations, broken furniture, maybe some tools. What she found instead made her breath catch in her throat. The basement was immaculate, not a speck of dust on the concrete floor, despite the thick layer coating everything upstairs. Industrial shelving lined the walls, filled with neat rows of boxes, each labeled with dates going back decades. In the center sat a heavy wooden desk with a modern computer setup that looked startlingly out of place in the cabin's rustic interior. Emma stirred, her fever-flushed cheek pressing against Sarah's shoulder. "Mama, what is this place?" Sarah didn't have an answer. Her grandfather had been a simple man, or so she'd thought. A retired forest ranger who'd lived alone in these mountains, who taught her to fish and identify bird calls during summer visits. The man who'd read her bedtime stories and made pancakes shaped like woodland animals had apparently been hiding something significant beneath his humble cabin. She set Emma down gently on an old leather chair, the only furniture that seemed to belong to the grandfather she remembered. "Stay here, sweetheart. Let Mama look around." The nearest box bore a label in her grandfather's careful handwriting, 1987 to 1992. Inside, she found manila folders stuffed with photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a black-and-white photo of a man in an expensive suit stepping out of a limousine. Red ink circled his face, and notes in the margins detailed his movements, associates, and what looked like criminal activities. Another folder contained bank statements from accounts she'd never heard of, showing deposits in amounts that made her stomach lurch. Her grandfather's forest ranger pension couldn't possibly have funded this kind of money. The computer hummed to life when she touched the mouse, no password required. The desktop contained dozens of folders with cryptic names: Operation Clearwater, Phoenix Files, Asset Protection. Her grandfather's face stared back at her from a corner icon. Not the weathered, kind features she remembered, but a younger man in what looked like a federal badge photo. "This can't be real," she whispered. But Emma's small voice interrupted her spinning thoughts. "Mama, I found something." Emma had discovered a hidden panel in the leather chair's armrest. Inside was a cell phone, sleek, modern, completely charged. As Sarah picked it up, it immediately buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "We know you're there. Your grandfather told us you might come. Meet tomorrow, 2 p.m., Riverside Diner on Highway 9. Come alone. Your daughter's life depends on it." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She clutched the phone, reading the message 3 times before it fully registered. Someone had been watching them. Someone knew they were here, knew about Emma, knew enough to threaten them. She grabbed the nearest box and dumped its contents across the desk. More photographs spilled out. Crime scenes, mugshots, what looked like FBI surveillance photos. In several images, she spotted a younger version of her grandfather, but he wasn't wearing a forest ranger uniform. He was in federal agent gear, standing alongside men with serious faces and official badges. A folder labeled Witness Protection Assets fell open, revealing a list of names and locations. Her grandfather's real name was at the top, not Robert Chen, but Agent Robert Castellanos, DEA. Retired after 30 years of deep undercover work, relocated to Montana under federal protection after testifying against a major crime syndicate. The room began to spin. Every memory of her childhood summers seemed to shift and realign. The way her grandfather had always been vigilant about locked doors, his insistence on teaching her evasion techniques he called wilderness survival, the odd phone calls he'd sometimes take in hushed tones while sending her outside to play. Emma's cough brought her crashing back to the present. Her daughter's fever was climbing again, and they had no medicine, no doctor, nowhere safe to go. And now, apparently, they were being watched by people dangerous enough to threaten a sick 5-year-old. Sarah's hands shook as she scrolled through more files on the computer. If her grandfather had been in witness protection, if he'd been hiding from dangerous people all these years, then coming here might have been the worst possible decision. But it was too late now. Someone already knew they were here. The phone buzzed again. Another message, "Don't try to run. We're not the ones you need to fear." Sarah pulled Emma close, her mind racing through impossible choices: trust strangers who seemed to know her grandfather's secrets, or flee with nowhere to go and no money to get there. Either path could lead to disaster. But looking down at Emma's pale, trusting face, Sarah realized she was out of options. The basement door creaked open with a sound that made Emma whimper and press closer to Sarah's leg. The wooden steps groaned under their weight as they descended into the musty darkness below, Sarah's phone flashlight casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. "It's okay, baby," Sarah whispered, though her own heart hammered against her ribs. "We're just looking around." The basement was larger than she'd expected, stretching beyond the footprint of the cabin above. Her grandfather had always claimed it was just storage space for old tools and Christmas decorations, nothing worth seeing. But as her light swept across the room, Sarah realized how wrong she'd been. The far wall wasn't stone like the others. It was wood, newer wood, and it didn't quite match the rest of the foundation. A workshop area occupied the center space, complete with a heavy wooden table scarred by years of use. Tools hung neatly from pegboard, and several filing cabinets lined one corner. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but underneath, the organization was meticulous. Emma's coughing fit echoed in the confined space, and Sarah quickly guided her to sit on the bottom step. "Stay right here, sweetheart. Don't move, okay?" Sarah approached the filing cabinets first, her hands trembling as she pulled open the top drawer. Inside, manila folders were arranged alphabetically, each one labeled with what appeared to be names. She pulled out a random file and opened it, her breath catching at what she found inside. Photographs, dozens of them, all in black and white, showing people in various locations around what looked like the town below. But these weren't casual snapshots. They were surveillance photos, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Each photo was dated and had notes scrawled on the back in her grandfather's familiar handwriting. Target confirmed at grocery store, 2:15 p.m. No security detail visible. Subject maintains routine. Vulnerable window between 7-8 a.m. weekdays. Financial records obtained. Pattern established. Sarah's hands shook as she flipped through more files. Each one contained similar surveillance materials, financial documents, and detailed notes about people's daily routines. Some folders were thick, spanning months of observation. Others contained only a few sheets with a red close stamp across the front. A soft thud from across the room made her spin around. Emma was still on the steps, but a book had fallen from a shelf Sarah hadn't noticed before. As she bent to pick it up, she saw it wasn't a book at all, but a leather journal. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and when she opened it, her grandfather's careful script filled every page. Day 1247. Received new assignment from Control. High priority target, significant security concerns, will require extended surveillance period. Day 1251. Target's weakness identified. Daughter has medical needs, regular hospital visits, opportunity window narrowing. Day 1267. Assignment completed successfully. Payment received, no complications. Sarah sank onto an old crate, the journal heavy in her hands. Assignment, target, payment. The words swam before her eyes as she tried to process what she was reading. Her grandfather, the man who had taught her to fish and helped with her homework, the gentle soul who made pancakes every Sunday morning, had been tracking people, hunting them. Emma's small voice broke through her shock. "Mommy, what are all those pictures?" Sarah looked up to find her daughter pointing at the wooden wall she'd noticed earlier. In her distraction, she'd missed what Emma's sharp eyes had caught. The wall was covered with photographs, but not the surveillance shots from the files. These were different. Newspaper clippings, missing person reports, and photographs of people who looked frightened, desperate, people who looked like her. She stood slowly, approaching the wall with growing dread. The newspaper headlines jumped out at her as her flashlight beam moved across them. Local businessman vanishes, missing mother of two, search continues for disappeared family. Some of the clippings were yellow with age, dating back decades. Others were more recent, some from just a few years ago. In the center of the wall hung a large map of the surrounding mountain region, marked with red pins and connecting strings like something from a detective movie. Each pin had a number, and those numbers corresponded to a list tacked beside the map. Names, dates, and dollar amounts in neat columns. Sarah's vision blurred as the truth crashed over her. Her grandfather hadn't just been watching people, he'd been making them disappear, and based on the meticulous records, the organized files, and the substantial sums listed in his ledger, he'd been very good at it. Emma coughed again, the sound sharper now, more urgent. They needed to get back upstairs, needed to get the child's medication. But as Sarah turned toward the steps, her light caught something that made her blood freeze. At the bottom of the numbered list, in handwriting much fresher than the rest, was a new entry. Her own name, written in her grandfather's careful script, with yesterday's date beside it. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the impossible image. Her grandfather, young and stern-faced, stood beside a man she'd never seen before, in front of what looked like a massive safe. Both men wore expensive suits that seemed at odds with everything she knew about her grandfather, humble life as a small-town mechanic. Emma's labored breathing echoed through the basement, pulling Sarah back to the present. She quickly tucked the photograph into her jacket pocket and knelt beside the metal cabinet, her fingers tracing the cold edges. The lock looked old but sturdy, designed to keep secrets buried. "Mama, what's down there?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper from the top of the stairs. "Just some old boxes, sweetheart. Go rest on the couch, okay? I'll be up in a minute." Sarah heard Emma's footsteps retreat across the creaky floorboards above. She turned her attention back to the cabinet, testing the lock. It didn't budge. She searched through the scattered papers on the floor, looking for anything that might give her a clue about what lay inside. A yellowed envelope caught her eye, partially hidden beneath a water-stained ledger. Her grandfather's name was written across it in elegant script, but the return address made her blood run cold. Federal Bureau of Investigation. With shaking fingers, she tore open the envelope. The letter inside was dated 30 years ago, shortly before her grandfather had taken her in after her parents' death. "Mr. Morrison, your cooperation in Operation Clearwater has been invaluable to this investigation. The enclosed documentation should be sufficient to ensure your family's safety, as previously discussed. We trust you understand the importance of maintaining absolute discretion regarding your involvement." Special Agent Reynolds. Sarah's mind reeled. Operation Clearwater? Her grandfather had worked with the FBI? Nothing made sense. The man who had taught her to fish and helped her with homework had been involved in some kind of federal investigation. She frantically searched through more papers, finding fragments of what looked like financial records, all bearing the letterhead of companies she'd never heard of. The amounts were staggering, millions of dollars moving through accounts with cryptic names. A loose floorboard creaked behind her, and Sarah spun around, her heart hammering. But it was just the old house settling. She forced herself to breathe slowly, trying to process what she was discovering. The sound of a car engine outside made her freeze. Through the small basement window, she could see headlights cutting through the growing dusk. Panic shot through her as she remembered the neighbor's warning about the property being watched. She stuffed as many documents as she could into her jacket and climbed the stairs as quietly as possible. Emma was curled up on the couch, her fever-flushed face peaceful in sleep. Sarah peered through the dirty front window, trying to get a better look at the vehicle. It was a dark sedan, idling at the end of the driveway. She couldn't make out the occupants, but something about the car's presence felt deliberately menacing. After several long minutes, it slowly pulled away, disappearing around the curve in the mountain road. Sarah's hands shook as she locked the front door and checked the windows. Whatever her grandfather had been involved in, it seemed the consequences were still following his family 3 decades later. She sat down at the small kitchen table and spread out the documents she'd salvaged. Bank statements, coded communications, and what appeared to be surveillance reports created a puzzle she couldn't yet piece together. But one name kept appearing throughout the papers: Blackwood Industries. A memory surfaced. Richard's father mentioning Blackwood Industries at a family dinner years ago, praising their expansion into mining operations. At the time, Sarah had barely paid attention to the business talk. Now she wondered if there was a connection. Emma stirred on the couch, coughing weakly. Sarah quickly gathered the papers and hid them in a kitchen drawer. Her daughter's medication would run out in 2 days, and the nearest pharmacy was a 40-minute drive down the mountain. She needed answers, but Emma's health had to come first. As she dampened a cloth to place on Emma's forehead, Sarah's mind churned with questions. Had her grandfather stolen money? Was he a whistleblower? Had he been protecting evidence of some crime? The photograph in her pocket seemed to burn against her ribs. The man standing beside her grandfather in the image had cold eyes and a predatory smile. Something about his face nagged at her, as if she'd seen it before but couldn't place where. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows and sending pine branches scraping against the roof. Sarah settled into the chair beside the couch, watching over her daughter while her mind raced through possibilities. Whatever secrets lay buried in this cabin, she was beginning to realize they might be more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. But they might also be the key to saving Emma's life. The manila folders scattered across the basement floor like fallen leaves, each one containing fragments of her grandfather's hidden life. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted another folder. This one marked Witness Protection Protocols, confidential. The red stamp across the top had faded to a rust-colored brown, but the implications hit her with crystal clarity. Emma stirred restlessly on the makeshift bed above, her small coughs echoing through the cabin's thin ceiling. Sarah forced herself to focus on the documents, though her mind reeled with questions. Her grandfather hadn't just worked for the government. He'd been deep in something that required fake identities, safe houses, and apparently this remote cabin as a final refuge. A photograph slipped from between the pages, landing face up on the concrete floor. Sarah's breath caught. The black and white image showed a younger version of her grandfather standing beside a man in an expensive suit. Both men were smiling, but there was something cold in their eyes that made her skin crawl. On the back, someone had written in her grandfather's careful script, Vincent Moretti, Chicago, 1987. Final meeting before relocation. The name Moretti sent a chill down her spine. Even she, with her sheltered suburban life, recognized that name from newspaper headlines. The Moretti crime family had controlled Chicago's underworld for decades until a series of federal prosecutions in the late 80s brought them down. Her grandfather had been there, at what appeared to be a crucial moment. Sarah pulled out more files, her movements growing frantic. Bank account numbers for offshore accounts, surveillance photos of men she didn't recognize, and then a thick folder labeled Testimony Transcripts, Thomas Mitchell. Her grandfather's real name wasn't even Thomas. According to the documents, he'd been born Patrick O'Brien in Boston, recruited by the FBI in 1985, and given a new identity after providing testimony that put 15 high-ranking mob members behind bars. The reality of it crashed over her like a cold wave. The gentle man who'd taught her to fish and told her bedtime stories had been living a lie for her entire life. Every camping trip to this cabin, every story about his quiet government job, every family gathering where he'd smiled and carved the turkey, all of it built on a foundation of deception. But as she dug deeper into the files, another picture emerged. Financial records showed that Patrick O'Brien, her grandfather, had used his witness protection payout to establish trust funds, not just for his own security, but for family members he couldn't even acknowledge, including one for Sarah Mitchell, established the day she was born. Her hands shook as she found the bank statements. The account had been growing for 28 years, accumulating interest and additional deposits that her grandfather had somehow continued to make even after his supposed death. The current balance made her gasp, $847,000. A loose sheet of paper fluttered from the back of the folder, covered in her grandfather's handwriting. This wasn't an official document. It was a letter, dated just 6 months before his death. "My dear Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then the worst has happened and you've had to come to the cabin. I pray this day never comes, but I've learned that hope is a luxury men like me can't afford. The money is yours, hidden where only family could find it. The account numbers are in the safe behind the water heater. Combination is your birthday. But know this, taking this money will put you in danger." The Moretti family was decimated but not destroyed. Some of them are still out there, still looking for Patrick O'Brien and anyone connected to him. I changed my name to Thomas Mitchell to protect you and your mother. If you access these accounts, there's a chance they'll find you. The letter went on to detail escape routes from the cabin, contact information for federal marshals who could provide new identities, and instructions for disappearing completely. It painted a picture of a man who'd spent decades looking over his shoulder, terrified that his past would catch up with the people he loved. A sound from upstairs made her freeze, footsteps on the front porch, slow and deliberate. Sarah quickly stuffed the most important documents into a folder and switched off the flashlight, plunging the basement into darkness. Through the thin basement ceiling, she could hear someone testing the cabin's front door handle. Her grandfather's warning suddenly felt very, very real. The cash felt surreal in Sarah's hands, thick bundles of worn bills that smelled faintly of dust and time. She'd counted it 3 times, her fingers trembling with each pass through the stacks. $47,000. More money than she'd ever held, more than she'd seen in years of scraping by while David's medical bills mounted. But the euphoria was already fading, replaced by a gnawing unease that settled in her stomach like spoiled food. She kept hearing her grandfather's voice from those long summer afternoons. "Sarah girl, remember that everything worth having comes with a price. The question is whether you're willing to pay it." What price had he paid for this fortune hidden beneath his cabin floor? Emma stirred in the corner where Sarah had made a makeshift bed from old blankets. Her daughter's breathing was more labored today, each inhale a visible struggle. The antibiotics from the clinic were helping, but Sarah could see the fever still burning in her flushed cheeks. They needed to get to a real hospital soon. The money could make that happen. The money could solve everything. Sarah forced herself to look at the leather portfolio again, spreading its contents across the dusty floor. The documents were organized with meticulous care, Bank statements, transaction records, correspondence. Her grandfather's handwriting filled the margins, notes in his careful script that she was only beginning to decipher. One folder contained photographs she hadn't noticed before. Black and white images of men in expensive suits shaking hands outside buildings she didn't recognize. Her grandfather appeared in several shots, younger, his face harder than she remembered. In one photo, he stood beside a man whose face had been deliberately scratched out with a pen. Beneath the photos lay a letter dated just 2 months before her grandfather's death. The letterhead read, Meridian Holdings, in elegant script. Mr. Chen, our patience has limits. The arrangement we made 30 years ago was quite clear. Your continued silence regarding the Riverside incident has been appreciated and compensated accordingly. However, recent developments suggest that certain parties may be asking questions about the events of 1993. We trust you understand the importance of maintaining our mutual understanding. The monthly stipend will continue as agreed, provided circumstances remain stable. Regards, J. Morrison. Sarah read the letter twice, her pulse quickening. 30 years ago would put it right around the time she'd come to live with her grandfather. She'd been 6 years old, traumatized by her parents' sudden death, and he'd taken her in without question. She'd always assumed it was family duty, love, the simple kindness of a man who'd already raised his children. Now she wondered if there had been other motivations. The sound of a car engine made her freeze. She quickly gathered the documents, her hands shaking as she stuffed them back into the portfolio. The engine grew closer, tires crunching on the gravel road that led to the cabin. Sarah crawled to the window and peered through the grimy glass. A black sedan was making its way up the winding drive, moving slowly, deliberately. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. Emma whimpered softly, and Sarah felt her maternal instincts kick into overdrive. She grabbed the money and portfolio, shoving them into the duffel bag along with their few possessions. Her mind raced through possibilities. Back door, windows, the root cellar she'd played in as a child. The car stopped in front of the cabin. 2 men emerged, both wearing dark suits despite the mountain heat. They moved with the calculated efficiency of people accustomed to finding things that didn't want to be found. Sarah scooped Emma into her arms, grateful her daughter was too weak to protest. She crept toward the back of the cabin, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Through the kitchen window, she could see a narrow path that led into the dense woods beyond. Behind her, she heard the front door rattle. Someone was testing the lock. She eased the back door open, wincing at the soft creak of hinges that needed oil. The forest beckoned, offering shadows and hiding places among the towering pines, but Emma was burning with fever, and Sarah had no idea how far they might need to run. A voice carried from the front of the cabin, muffled but authoritative.
Check around back. She might have already been here.
They weren't looking for her grandfather's things. They were looking for her. Sarah stepped into the cooling mountain air, Emma's weight solid and warm in her arms. Behind them, the cabin that had been her childhood sanctuary now felt like a trap. Ahead lay the unknown wilderness, and somewhere beyond that, answers to questions she was only beginning to understand. The money in her bag could buy Emma's treatment, could give them a fresh start. But first, Sarah had to figure out why powerful men were hunting them and what her grandfather had really been hiding all these years. The fluorescent lights in the hospital waiting room buzzed overhead like trapped insects as Sarah clutched the manila envelope against her chest. Emma had finally fallen asleep in her arms after another round of tests, her small face pale against Sarah's shoulder. Dr. Martinez had promised results within the hour, but Sarah's mind wasn't on blood counts or treatment options anymore. It was on the photographs burning a hole through the envelope. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was carefully neutral. Sarah had learned to read that look over the past months. It meant complicated news, the kind that required delicate delivery. "Mrs. Chen, I'd like to discuss Emma's latest results with you privately," he said, glancing at the sleeping child. Sarah's heart hammered as she gently transferred Emma to the chair beside her, tucking her jacket around the little girl's shoulders. She followed Dr. Martinez into his office, the envelope still pressed against her ribs. "Emma's condition is progressing faster than we initially projected," he began, settling behind his desk. "We need to move more aggressively with treatment options. There's a clinical trial at Children's Hospital in Denver that could be promising, but—" He paused, his fingers steepled. "The costs would be substantial. Even with insurance, we're looking at expenses your family likely can't shoulder." Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. "How much?" "Conservatively, 200,000 over 6 months. That's assuming everything goes smoothly." The number hung between them like a death sentence. Sarah thought of her empty bank account, her maxed-out credit cards, the cabin with its leaking roof and broken windows. Then she thought of the photographs in her hands. "Doctor," she said slowly, "if someone had access to that kind of money, how quickly could Emma start treatment?" "Within 2 weeks, assuming she qualifies for the trial." His eyebrows raised slightly. "Sarah, I understand this is overwhelming, but I want you to know there are other options, payment plans." 2 weeks, Sarah repeated, her mind racing. "Thank you." The drive back to the cabin passed in a blur. Emma dozed in her car seat while Sarah's thoughts churned like storm clouds. $200,000. It might as well have been 2 million. Unless... She thought about Marcus Webb, about the desperation she'd heard in his voice when he'd called, about powerful people who would pay anything to keep certain secrets buried. The cabin felt different when they returned, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Sarah tucked Emma into bed, then spread the photographs across the kitchen table under the harsh overhead light. 60 years old, but the images were crystal clear. Her grandfather's handwriting on the back, names, dates, locations, a meticulous record of something that could destroy lives. Her phone rang, making her jump. Unknown number. "Hello, Mrs. Chen? This is Detective Ray Hoffman, Colorado State Police. I understand you've been staying at Henry Morrison's property." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "Yes." "Is there a problem?" "We'd like to ask you a few questions about your grandfather. There have been some inquiries about him recently. Would it be possible to meet tomorrow morning?" "What kind of inquiries?" A pause. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Would 10 o'clock work?" After she hung up, Sarah stared at the photographs with new urgency. Someone else was asking questions about her grandfather. Someone with enough influence to get the state police involved. The net was closing, and she was running out of time. She thought about Emma's pale face, about the trial in Denver, about the life her daughter deserved to live. Then she picked up her phone and dialed the number Marcus Webb had called from. "Webb Residence. This is Sarah Chen. I need to speak with Marcus. I'm sorry, Mr. Webb isn't taking calls. Tell him it's about Colorado, 1963. Tell him I have something he wants." The line went quiet for several long minutes. When Marcus finally came on, his voice was tight with barely controlled tension. "What do you want?" "To make a deal," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I have photographs, original prints with documentation. I think you know what they show." His breathing was audible over the line. "Where?" "Safe, for now." Sarah looked toward Emma's bedroom door. "I want $250,000. Cash. In exchange, you get the photos and the negatives." "You're making a very dangerous mistake, Mrs. Chen." "No," Sarah said quietly. "I'm saving my daughter's life. You have 24 hours to decide. After that, I start making calls to journalists." She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Outside, wind rattled the cabin's windows like fingers trying to get in. Sarah gathered the photographs and held them against her chest, feeling the weight of her grandfather's secrets and her daughter's future pressing down on her shoulders. Tomorrow the detective would come with his questions. Tonight, she had to decide how far she was willing to fall to save the person she loved most. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have as Sarah carried it to the kitchen table. Emma was finally sleeping peacefully in the bedroom, her fever broken after another dose of antibiotics. The silence in the cabin pressed against Sarah's ears as she opened the folder with trembling fingers. The first document made her stomach drop. A birth certificate for someone named Michael Chen, born in 1962. The address listed was in San Francisco's Chinatown. Sarah stared at the name, her grandfather's careful handwriting in the margin noting monthly check, $500. Beneath it, another birth certificate. Jennifer Hawkins, born 1967 in Portland. More notes in her grandfather's handwriting. College fund, $2,000 deposited April 15th. Document after document revealed the same pattern. Birth certificates, school records, medical bills, all paid for by her grandfather, all for children she'd never heard of, scattered across 3 states. 23 names in total. Sarah's hands shook as she reached the bottom of the stack. There, paper clipped to a faded photograph of her grandfather holding a baby she didn't recognize, was a letter addressed to her in his familiar script. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've found what I hoped would remain buried forever. But life has a way of forcing our secrets into the light, doesn't it?" The letter continued in her grandfather's measured tone, the same voice that had read her bedtime stories and taught her to fish in the mountain streams. "The children in these files are my responsibility, though not in the way you might think. Years ago, before you came to live with me, I worked for an organization that promised to help troubled families. We called it the Haven Project. We told ourselves we were saving children from abuse, from poverty, from parents who couldn't care for them properly." Sarah's vision blurred as she read on. "What we were really doing was stealing babies, Sarah. Wealthy families would pay enormous sums for healthy infants, and we would find ways to take children from families we deemed unfit. A mother struggling with addiction, a father who couldn't find work, families living in poverty. We convinced ourselves we were giving these children better lives." The letter slipped from Sarah's fingers, drifting to the floor. She pressed her hands to her mouth, bile rising in her throat. Her grandfather, the man who had raised her with such love and patience, had been involved in something so monstrous. She forced herself to pick up the letter and continue reading. "I realized too late what we had become. When I finally understood the evil we were perpetrating, I tried to get out. But they had leverage over me, over all of us. So I made a different choice. I started tracking down the children we had taken, documenting where they went, keeping records, and when I could, I sent money to the families we had destroyed." Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank into a chair. Through the window, she could see the old well where she had played as a child, never knowing the darkness that lurked beneath her grandfather's kind exterior. "The basement contains evidence of everything, Sarah. Names, locations, transactions. People in high places were involved. Judges, social workers, even police officers. Some of them are still alive, still in positions of power. This information could bring justice to families who never knew what happened to their children. But it would also make you a target." A floorboard creaked somewhere in the cabin, and Sarah's head snapped up. The sound came again, deliberate and heavy. Someone was walking across the front porch. Sarah quickly gathered the documents, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the kitchen window, she caught a glimpse of movement, a dark figure circling toward the back of the cabin. She grabbed the folder and Emma's medication, then crept toward the bedroom. Emma was still sleeping, her small face peaceful in the dim light. Sarah gently shook her daughter's shoulder. "Emma, sweetie, we need to go. Right now." "Mummy?" Emma's voice was groggy, confused. "Shh, baby. We're going to play a quiet game, okay? Like hide and seek." The front door handle rattled. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she heard the distinct sound of metal against metal. Someone was picking the lock. She scooped Emma into her arms, grabbed their few belongings and moved toward the bedroom window. Her fingers fumbled with the old latch as footsteps echoed from the main room of the cabin. The window finally gave way with a soft groan. "Mummy, I'm scared," Emma whispered against her neck. "I know, sweetheart, but we're going to be brave together just like always." Sarah climbed through the window, Emma clinging to her like a baby koala. Behind them, she heard the front door finally give way, followed by heavy footsteps spreading through the cabin. They disappeared into the dark forest, Sarah clutching both her daughter and the terrible truth about her grandfather's past. The silence in the basement felt heavier now, pressing against Sarah's chest like a physical weight. Emma had fallen asleep against her shoulder, her small body finally relaxed after the fever had broken an hour ago. But sleep eluded Sarah as she stared at the metal boxes scattered across the concrete floor, their contents spilled like accusations in the lamplight. She'd spent the last 3 hours piecing together fragments of her grandfather's hidden life. Bank statements showing regular deposits of enormous sums, photographs of men in expensive suits shaking hands in what looked like warehouse settings. Most disturbing of all, a leather-bound ledger filled with her grandfather's careful handwriting, documenting transactions that made her stomach turn. The grandfather who had taught her to fish, who had bandaged her scraped knees and told her bedtime stories about brave princesses, had apparently been involved in something far darker than she could have imagined. A soft knock echoed through the cabin above, freezing Sarah's blood. The sound was deliberate, patient, not the frantic pounding of someone seeking help, but the measured rhythm of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Sarah's hand instinctively tightened around Emma, who stirred but didn't wake. The knocking came again, 3 slow raps that seemed to reverberate through the floorboards into the basement. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah gathered the most incriminating documents and shoved them back into the nearest box. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had someone seen the light from the basement window? Were they just checking on what they assumed was an empty cabin? The knocking stopped. Sarah held her breath, straining to hear footsteps moving away from the front door. Instead, she heard something far worse, the soft scrape of metal against metal. Someone was picking the lock. Terror shot through her as she realized how trapped they were. The basement had only one exit, the narrow wooden stairs leading up to the kitchen. If someone was breaking in above, she and Emma would be cornered. The lock clicked open, with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire cabin. Sarah's eyes darted around the basement, searching for options. In the far corner, behind the oil furnace, she spotted what looked like a small window near the ceiling. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it might be their only chance. Heavy footsteps moved across the kitchen floor above. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. "Hello?" a man's voice called out. "I know someone's here. The tire tracks in the driveway are fresh, and I can smell the wood smoke from the chimney." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The voice was unfamiliar, gravelly and confident. This wasn't some random break-in. This person knew the cabin, knew what to look for. She gathered Emma in her arms, grateful that her daughter remained deeply asleep. Moving on silent feet, Sarah crept toward the corner window. The footsteps above moved methodically from room to room, searching. "You might as well come out," the voice continued, closer now. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just want to talk about what you might have found down there." The words sent ice through Sarah's veins. He knew about the basement. He knew about the boxes. As she reached the window, Sarah realized it was secured with an old-fashioned latch, green with age. She worked at it carefully, trying not to make any noise. The metal protested with tiny squeaks that sounded deafening in the silence. The footsteps stopped directly above her. A moment later, she heard the basement door creak open. "I really hoped we could do this the easy way," the voice said, and Sarah could hear him beginning to descend the wooden stairs. The latch finally gave way. Sarah pushed at the window, but it was stuck, painted shut by years of weather and neglect. She put her shoulder against it, applying steady pressure while supporting Emma's weight. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. "Well, well," the voice said, and she could hear genuine surprise in it. "Tom's little granddaughter. You've grown up quite a bit since I last saw you." Sarah spun around, clutching Emma protectively. A tall man with silver hair and wearing an expensive coat stood by the boxes, studying the scattered documents. His face was weathered but kind, which somehow made his presence even more unsettling. "You don't remember me, do you?" he said, straightening up. "Frank Morrison. I was at your grandfather's funeral, stood right behind you during the service." The name meant nothing to her, but something about his eyes triggered a vague memory. A man in a black suit watching her with unusual intensity as they lowered her grandfather's coffin into the ground. "What do you want?" Sarah managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank gestured at the scattered papers around his feet. "The same thing you want, I imagine. Answers. Though I suspect the questions we're asking are very different." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, Sarah, what exactly do you think you've discovered about your grandfather?" The manila folder trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the photograph paper-clipped to the top document. Her grandfather stood beside a younger version of Detective Morrison, both wearing police uniforms, arms draped over each other's shoulders like old friends. The date scrawled on the back read 1987, 35 years ago. Emma's labored breathing filled the silence as Sarah's mind raced. Morrison had claimed he didn't know her grandfather well, just enough to check on the property occasionally, but this photograph suggested something much deeper, a partnership that had lasted decades. Why had he lied? She flipped through the documents beneath the photo, police reports, witness statements, evidence logs, all bearing her grandfather's signature as lead detective. The cases were from the late 80s and early 90s, mostly missing persons reports for young women. Sarah's stomach churned as she read the names: Jessica Chen, Maria Vasquez, Rebecca Thompson. At least a dozen files, each one stamped case closed in red ink. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that made her blood run cold. Her grandfather's familiar scrawl filled every available space, connecting dots between cases that seemed unrelated. He'd drawn lines between dates, circled addresses, highlighted suspicious details that other investigators had apparently missed. "What were you really doing, Grandpa?" she whispered. Emma stirred on the couch, her fever-flushed cheek pressed against the worn cushions. Sarah glanced at her daughter, then back at the files. Whatever her grandfather had been involved in, whatever Morrison was hiding, it would have to wait. Emma needed medicine, and they were down to their last few doses. Sarah was about to close the folder when she noticed something else, a letter tucked behind the police reports, written in her grandfather's careful handwriting. The paper was newer than the other documents, dated just 3 months before his death. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've found what I've spent 30 years trying to hide. The truth about those girls, about what really happened to them, died with the man we thought we'd stopped. But we were wrong. He had help, and that help is still out there. Morrison thinks we can keep this buried, that the families are better off not knowing. He's wrong. They deserve the truth, even if it destroys everything we built our careers on. I've hidden the real evidence where only you would think to look. Remember the stories I used to tell you about the old mining tunnels? Some treasures are buried for good reason, but some secrets are too dangerous to stay hidden. Be careful who you trust, Sarah. The corruption goes deeper than you can imagine. All my love, Grandpa." Sarah's hands shook as she reread the letter. Mining tunnels. She remembered those stories well. Her grandfather used to tell her about the abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed the mountain, how miners had hidden their most precious finds in the deepest, most secret places. She'd always assumed they were just fairy tales meant to entertain a restless child. But if her grandfather was telling the truth, if there was more evidence hidden somewhere in those tunnels, then Morrison's frequent visits to the cabin took on a sinister new meaning. He wasn't checking on the property, he was looking for whatever her grandfather had hidden. A sound outside made her freeze. Car doors slamming, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Sarah scrambled to the window and peered through the dusty curtains. Morrison's patrol car sat in the driveway, but he wasn't alone. A second man in a dark suit stood beside him, scanning the cabin's exterior with predatory interest. "Shit," Sarah breathed, clutching the folder to her chest. She looked around frantically, her mind racing through options. The basement would be the first place they'd search if they'd seen her come up from there. The bedroom offered no escape route, and the kitchen window faced the driveway where they'd spot her immediately. The front door rattled as someone tried the handle. Sarah made a split-second decision. She grabbed Emma from the couch, her daughter's fevered body limp in her arms. The back door led to a small porch that connected to an overgrown trail her grandfather had used for hiking. If she could reach the tree line before Morrison and his companion made it around the cabin, they might have a chance. "Sarah?" Morrison's voice carried through the thin walls. "I know you're in there. We just want to talk." The sound of splintering wood told her they were done asking permission. Sarah burst through the back door, Emma clutched against her chest and the folder tucked under her arm. Behind them, she could hear heavy footsteps moving through the cabin, Morrison's voice calling her name with increasing urgency. The forest loomed ahead, dark and welcoming. Somewhere in those mountains were the answers her grandfather had died protecting. But first, she had to keep her daughter alive long enough to find them. The manila envelope crackled in Sarah's trembling hands as she pulled out its contents by the dim light of her phone's flashlight. Emma slept fitfully on the makeshift bed above, her breathing labored but steady. Sarah had waited until her daughter drifted off before returning to examine what she'd found hidden behind the loose brick. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, dating back what looked like 40 years. The first showed her grandfather as a younger man, standing beside a woman Sarah didn't recognize. They were both wearing official-looking badges, and behind them stretched an imposing government building she couldn't identify. Her hands stilled as she studied her grandfather's face. Even in the grainy photograph, his expression held the same quiet intensity she remembered, but there was something else. A hardness around his eyes that she'd never seen during the gentle years he'd raised her after her parents died. The next photo made her stomach lurch. It showed the same woman from the first picture, but now she lay motionless on what appeared to be a medical examination table. Dark bruises ringed her neck, and her eyes stared sightlessly at the camera. Someone had written on the back in her grandfather's familiar handwriting, "Victoria Chen, subject 47, terminated." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Terminated. The clinical word hung in her mind like a death sentence. She flipped through more photos with mounting horror. Men, women, even teenagers, all photographed in the same sterile setting, all bearing signs of violence, all marked with numbers and that terrible word. At the bottom of the pile, she found documents bearing official government seals. The letterhead read Project Mindbridge, classified and was dated 1978. Her grandfather's name appeared repeatedly throughout the papers, along with his signature authorizing various procedures on what the documents coldly referred to as test subjects. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Sarah backed away from the evidence scattered on the floor, her mind reeling. The man who had bandaged her scraped knees, who had taught her to fish in mountain streams, who had read her bedtime stories and held her when nightmares came, that same man had been part of something monstrous. A soft thud from upstairs made her freeze. Emma was still sleeping. Sarah could hear her congested breathing from here. The sound came again, deliberate and measured. Footsteps. Sarah quickly gathered the photos and documents, shoving them back into the envelope. Her phone's battery was dying, the light growing dimmer by the second. She tucked the evidence into her jacket and crept toward the basement stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The footsteps moved across the cabin's main floor, slow and searching. Sarah pressed herself against the basement wall, hardly daring to breathe. Through the thin floorboards, she could hear Emma's labored breathing continue undisturbed. Whoever was up there was being careful not to wake her. A beam of bright light suddenly swept across the basement windows at ground level, then another, from a different direction. Multiple people, multiple flashlights. They weren't random intruders, they were searching systematically, professionally. Sarah's mind raced back to the government documents in her jacket. 40 years old, but maybe not forgotten. Maybe someone had been watching this place, waiting to see if anyone would come looking for her grandfather's secrets. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, right above the spot where she'd found the loose brick. A muffled voice spoke, too quiet to make out words, but the tone was authoritative. Military, perhaps, or federal agents. Emma coughed upstairs, a wet, rattling sound that made Sarah's maternal instincts scream at her to run to her daughter, but the footsteps immediately moved toward the sound, and Sarah heard the soft creak of Emma's bedroom door opening. "Just a sick kid," a man's voice said, clearer now. "Sleeping. Check the basement," another voice replied. "The readings are strongest down there." Readings. Sarah's blood turned to ice. They had equipment, technology that could detect something in this basement. The evidence she carried might not be the only secret hidden down here. She spotted a narrow crawl space beneath the basement stairs just as boots began descending toward her. The beam of a powerful flashlight swept the area where she'd been standing moments before. Sarah squeezed into the cramped space, pressing herself as far back as possible, the envelope crinkling softly against her chest. The boots reached the basement floor, 2 sets, moving with practiced coordination. Their lights played across every surface, probing shadows, examining the walls brick by brick. One of them stopped at the loose brick where she'd made her discovery. "Here," the first voice said. "Someone's been at this recently. The mortar's fresh." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to control her breathing as the men searched the hiding spot she'd already emptied. Above them, Emma coughed again, and Sarah had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. Her daughter needed medicine, needed care, and here Sarah was trapped in a basement with evidence of her grandfather's crimes while armed strangers searched for secrets that could destroy them both. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that made every footstep crunch like breaking glass. Sarah pulled her coat tighter as she approached the cabin. Emma's fever finally broken after 3 days of desperate worry. The antibiotics from Dr. Chen had worked, but the relief was overshadowed by what she'd discovered in town. Marcus knew about the money. The way the bank teller had looked at her when she'd tried to make a small withdrawal, the hushed phone call that followed, the sudden appearance of a black sedan parked across from the medical clinic. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Somehow, her father-in-law had traced the offshore accounts. Inside the cabin, Emma was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, her breathing steady and unlabored. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead and made her way to the basement, her mind racing. She needed to move the remaining cash, close the accounts, disappear completely. But first, she had to understand exactly what her grandfather had been involved in. The ledger lay open where she'd left it, its pages filled with names, dates, and amounts that painted a picture of systematic money laundering spanning decades. But tonight, something caught her eye that she'd missed before, a loose page tucked between the back cover and binding. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the yellowed paper. It was a letter written in her grandfather's careful handwriting, dated just 3 months before his death. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found what I never wanted you to find. I know you must have questions, and you deserve answers, even if those answers destroy the memory of the man you thought you knew. I was never a simple carpenter. For 40 years, I laundered money for people who would have killed me if I'd refused. It started small, a favor for a neighbor who needed help hiding assets from a vindictive ex-wife. But these things grow, Sarah. They consume you one small compromise at a time. The men I worked for weren't entirely evil. Some were, yes, but others were desperate people hiding from abusive spouses, witnesses in protection, immigrants trying to build new lives. I told myself I was helping more than I was hurting. The money in these accounts is clean now. I spent years washing it through legitimate investments, charitable donations, small business loans. Whatever's left is yours by right, payment for the grandfather you lost to fear and secrecy. But Sarah, if dangerous people come looking, if my past threatens your future, walk away. Don't let my mistakes destroy the beautiful life you've built. All my love, Grandpa Joe." Sarah's hands shook as she folded the letter. The beautiful life he'd mentioned was already destroyed, shattered the moment Marcus had shown his true colors. But dangerous people were indeed coming, and she was running out of places to hide. A sound from upstairs made her freeze, the soft creak of a floorboard that never made noise unless someone was trying to be quiet. Emma was asleep. Sarah had been alone. She quietly closed the ledger and slipped it back into the safe, then grabbed the baseball bat she'd started keeping in the basement. Each step up the stairs felt like an eternity, her heart hammering against her ribs. The main floor was empty, but the front door was slightly ajar. Snow had blown across the threshold, and fresh footprints led from the porch toward the tree line. Someone had been inside. Sarah rushed to Emma's room, relief flooding through her when she found her daughter still sleeping safely. But on the nightstand sat something that hadn't been there before. A single white business card with no name, just a phone number written in black ink. She turned the card over. On the back, someone had written, "We need to talk. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Miller's Diner. Come alone." A friend of Joe's. Sarah's blood ran cold. Her grandfather's network was still active, still watching. But were they allies or enemies? The letter suggested he'd helped all kinds of people, but it also mentioned those who would have killed him for refusing their business. She checked every window, every door, making sure they were locked tight. Then she sat in the darkness by Emma's bedside, the baseball bat across her knees, watching the snow fall and wondering if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The smart thing would be to pack up tonight, take what money she could access quickly, and disappear. Start over somewhere far away where neither Marcus nor her grandfather's associates could find them. But running meant always looking over her shoulder. It meant Emma growing up in fear, never staying anywhere long enough to make friends or feel secure. And deep down, Sarah was tired of running, tired of being a victim. Tomorrow, she would go to Miller's Diner. She would meet this friend of Joe's, and she would finally learn whether her grandfather's legacy would save them or damn them both. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers demanding entry. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain air crisp and eerily quiet. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bank statements spread before her like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. The numbers didn't lie. Her grandfather had been moving enormous sums of money for decades, far more than any legitimate business could generate. Emma coughed from the living room, a wet sound that sent panic shooting through Sarah's chest. The medications were helping, but they needed to get to the specialist appointment next week. Everything depended on that consultation, and now she wondered if the money funding it was built on blood. "Mummy?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain. "Are you okay?" Sarah forced a smile and joined her daughter on the couch. "I'm fine, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" "Better. The medicine tastes gross, but it helps." Emma leaned against her mother's shoulder. "I like it here. It feels safe." Safe. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. They were living in a house that had hidden a criminal empire, funded by money that might have come from destroying other families. How could anywhere feel safe again? A knock at the door made them both freeze. Sarah's heart hammered as she peered through the curtains. A woman stood on the porch, tall, elegant, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. She looked nothing like the dangerous men Sarah had imagined might come calling. "Stay here," Sarah whispered to Emma, then opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain latch engaged. "Sarah Chen?" The woman's voice was cultured, with a slight accent Sarah couldn't place. "Who's asking?" "My name is Margaret Hoffman. I was your grandfather's attorney." She held up a leather briefcase. "We need to talk." Sarah's grip tightened on the door. "He's been dead for 8 years." "I know. I've been waiting for you to find the basement." The words hit Sarah like ice water. She stared at the woman's face, searching for deception, but found only patient certainty. "How did you—" "The security system sends alerts." "May I come in?" "What I have to tell you can't be discussed on an open porch." Against every instinct screaming danger, Sarah unlatched the chain. Margaret stepped inside, her eyes immediately finding Emma on the couch. "Beautiful child," she said softly. "She has your grandfather's eyes." Sarah positioned herself between Margaret and Emma. "Whatever this is about, leave her out of it." Margaret nodded approvingly. Good. Henry said you'd be protective. She set her briefcase on the coffee table. He told me about Emma's condition. How is she responding to treatment? Sarah's blood chilled. How could you possibly know about her illness? Because I've been watching over your family since Henry died. The medical bills, your husband's gambling debts, your in-laws' harassment. I've been documenting everything, waiting for the day you'd need sanctuary. You've been spying on us? Protecting you. Margaret opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder. Your grandfather knew his past would catch up eventually. He spent his final years preparing for it. Sarah grabbed the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photographs of her and Emma taken over the years, at the park, outside the hospital, even some from their wedding. But these weren't surveillance photos. They showed love, a grandfather's desperate need to stay connected to family he couldn't approach. He hired you to watch us? He hired me to protect you. The money in those accounts downstairs, it wasn't from criminal activity, Sarah. It was restitution. What? Margaret pulled out another document. In 1987, your grandfather discovered that his business partner was using their legitimate import company as a front for arms dealing. When Henry tried to expose him, the partner threatened you and your mother. Henry was forced to stay silent and help launder the money. Sarah's legs gave out. She sank onto the couch next to Emma, who looked worried but stayed quiet. For 15 years, he documented everything while pretending to cooperate. Names, dates, bank transfers, weapons shipments. He built an airtight case while secretly working with federal investigators. That's impossible. He never told you because telling you would have put you in danger. The operation was finally shut down in 2002. Your grandfather's cooperation was essential to the convictions. As part of the plea agreement, he was allowed to keep the laundered funds as restitution for the victims. Margaret handed Sarah a letter bearing official FBI letterhead. Every penny in those accounts is legally yours. Your grandfather's final gift, insurance against the day when his family might need sanctuary. Sarah stared at the letter, the words blurring through tears. He was trying to protect us? Always. Even when it meant sacrificing his relationship with you. Margaret's voice softened. He loved you more than his own life, Sarah. Everything he did was to ensure you'd be safe. Emma reached over and took her mother's hand. Mommy, why are you crying? Sarah pulled her daughter close, finally understanding that sometimes the greatest love required the greatest sacrifice. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Sarah sat at her grandfather's old desk, surrounded by towers of documents and photographs. Emma slept peacefully in the bedroom, her breathing steady and strong for the first time in weeks. The experimental treatment was working, but Sarah knew they were living on borrowed time until the next payment was due. She picked up another folder from the stack, this one marked with her grandfather's careful handwriting, property records, 1987 to 2003. As she opened it, a sealed envelope fell onto her lap, heavier than the others. Her name was written across it in his familiar script, but underneath, in smaller letters, only if you find the truth about Marcus. Sarah's hands trembled as she tore open the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small brass key she'd never seen before. My dearest Sarah, the letter began, if you are reading this, then you have discovered what I hoped would remain buried forever. Marcus Holloway was not just my business partner, he was my closest friend. What happened to him haunts me still, but I need you to understand that everything I did was to protect our family, including you and your future children. Sarah's breath caught. She had found Marcus's name mentioned in several documents, always in connection with large sums of money, but the details had remained frustratingly vague. The key opens a safety deposit box at First Mountain Bank, box 247. Inside you will find evidence that Marcus discovered something that could have destroyed powerful people in this town. He came to me for help and I failed him. The money we've lived on, the money that paid for your education and your mother's care, it came from Marcus's discovery. I took it after he died, telling myself it was to protect his family, but I know now I was also protecting myself." Sarah's mind raced. The bank was only 20 minutes away. She looked toward the bedroom where Emma slept, then back at the key glinting in her palm. The men who killed Marcus think the evidence died with him. They don't know about the safety deposit box. But Sarah, if you choose to use what's inside, there will be consequences. These people have money, influence, and no conscience. They've waited 30 years to feel safe. They won't hesitate to protect themselves again. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She thought about the expensive car that had driven slowly past the cabin yesterday, and the feeling she'd had of being watched during their trips to town. "I'm sorry to burden you with this choice, but circumstances may force your hand. Know that whatever you decide, I love you and I'm proud of the woman you've become. Your grandfather, Thomas." Sarah folded the letter carefully, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. Marcus Holloway had been murdered for something he'd discovered, and her grandfather had kept the evidence hidden for 3 decades. Now that evidence might be the only thing standing between Emma and death. She grabbed her jacket and car keys, then paused at Emma's bedside. Her daughter's face was peaceful, color finally returning to her cheeks. Whatever the risks, Sarah had to know what was in that safety deposit box. The drive to town felt eternal. Sarah kept checking her rearview mirror, but the mountain roads remained empty. At the bank, she approached the teller with forced confidence, presenting the key and identifying herself as Thomas Mitchell's granddaughter. The young woman led her downstairs to a small, windowless room lined with metal boxes. Box 247 was larger than Sarah had expected. Inside, she found thick manila folders, photographs, and what appeared to be financial records. The top folder was labeled Mountain Vista Development Corporation, Environmental Cover-Up. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. The documents inside detailed a massive toxic waste dumping operation that had contaminated the groundwater across 3 counties in the late 1980s. The cover-up involved bribes to environmental officials, falsified test results, and the deliberate relocation of families away from affected areas without telling them why. But it was the list of names that made Sarah's blood run cold. Judge Harrison, who had overseen her custody hearing, County Commissioner Wells, who controlled local development permits, and at the top of the list, Richard Holloway, Marcus's own brother and the current mayor of their town. A photograph showed Marcus Holloway standing next to surveying equipment near a creek Sarah recognized. It ran directly through several neighborhoods where children had developed unusual cancers in the 1990s. On the back, someone had written, "Marcus discovered the truth about the dumping sites, threatened to go public despite his brother's involvement." Sarah gathered the documents quickly, her heart pounding. She now understood why her grandfather had been so careful, so paranoid about keeping their family under the radar. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice for an entire community that had been poisoned and lied to for 30 years. As she climbed the stairs from the vault, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Come alone. You know what this is about." The morning light filtered through the cabin windows as Sarah sat at her grandfather's old desk, surrounded by decades of carefully organized records. Emma slept peacefully in the bedroom, her breathing steady and strong for the first time in weeks. The experimental treatment they'd found in the hidden laboratory had worked better than Sarah had dared to hope. But now came the harder part. Detective Morrison arrived just after 9, his expression grim as he stepped through the front door. Behind him came Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the federal investigator Sarah had contacted through the encrypted files. Chen's sharp eyes immediately swept the room, taking in every detail. "Miss Chen," Sarah said, standing to greet them, "thank you for coming." "When you sent me those files, I knew we had to move quickly," Chen replied, setting down a briefcase. "What your grandfather discovered could revolutionize treatment for dozens of rare diseases. But first, we need to address the legal implications." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Sarah, I have to ask this officially. Did you know about any of this before you came here?" "Nothing," Sarah said firmly. "I thought I was breaking into an abandoned cabin to give my daughter shelter. I had no idea about the laboratory or the research. Chen opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Based on the documentation you provided, your grandfather appears to have been conducting legitimate research that was forcibly shut down by pharmaceutical interests. The compounds he developed, including the one that helped your daughter, were his legal intellectual property. But he stole equipment from the university, Morrison pointed out. Equipment he helped design and build, Chen countered. Equipment that was being used to suppress potentially life-saving research. The legal picture is complicated, but there's precedent for researchers protecting their work from corporate interference. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. What happens now? Now we document everything properly, Chen said. Your grandfather kept meticulous records, but we need to verify his findings through proper channels. The good news is that several pharmaceutical companies will be very interested in licensing his work legitimately. Morrison nodded slowly. And the federal investigation into the original suppression of his research? That's where things get interesting, Chen smiled grimly. Some very powerful people went to great lengths to bury Dr. Williams' work. They won't be happy when it resurfaces. A soft cough from the bedroom interrupted them. Sarah hurried to check on Emma, finding her daughter sitting up in bed, looking more alert than she had in months. "Mama, I'm hungry," Emma said, and Sarah's eyes filled with tears of relief. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'll make you something right away." As Sarah prepared Emma's breakfast, Chen and Morrison continued their discussion in low voices. She caught fragments about protective custody, witness protection, and federal oversight. The magnitude of what her grandfather had hidden was still sinking in. "There's something else," Chen said when Sarah returned. "Your grandfather wasn't working alone. We've identified at least 3 other researchers who were forced out of various institutions around the same time. They've been in hiding, afraid to surface with their own work." "Hiding for 20 years?" Sarah asked. "The pharmaceutical industry has a long memory and deep pockets," Morrison said darkly. "People who threaten billion-dollar markets have a tendency to disappear or have accidents." Chen pulled out a photograph of a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair. "This is Dr. Rebecca Martinez. She was your grandfather's closest collaborator. She's been living under an assumed name in Oregon, working as a small-town family physician. When I contacted her yesterday and told her about you, she cried." Sarah stared at the photograph. "She knew my grandfather?" "She loved him," Chen said gently. "They planned to marry before everything fell apart. She has letters he wrote her, talking about you and how proud he was of raising you after your parents died." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her grandfather had sacrificed not just his career, but his chance at love and family to continue his research in isolation, and all to help children like Emma. "She wants to meet you," Chen continued. "She's already on her way here. With her help and the other surviving researchers, we can establish a proper foundation to continue your grandfather's work, legitimately this time." Morrison's radio crackled, and he stepped outside to take the call. When he returned, his expression was troubled. "We may have a problem," he said. "There's been unusual activity around the area, vehicles that don't belong, people asking questions in town about the old Williams place." Chen's face hardened. "How much time do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be corporate investigators, could be something more serious." Sarah felt the familiar fear creeping back. Just when it seemed like everything might work out, new threats emerged. "What do we do?" she asked. Chen closed her briefcase with a decisive snap. "We move fast. I'm calling in federal protection, and we're getting you and Emma somewhere safe while we sort this out." Sarah looked toward the bedroom where Emma was finally healing, then at the laboratory below where her grandfather's legacy waited. Running again felt like betrayal, but staying might mean losing everything. The drive down the mountain felt like descending from another world. Sarah gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her grandfather's confession letter crumpled in her jacket pocket. Behind her, Emma slept peacefully in her car seat, blissfully unaware that their entire future hinged on what would happen in the next few hours. The GPS directed her through unfamiliar streets until she reached the address from the letter, a modest ranch house with overgrown hedges and peeling paint. Sarah sat in the car for several minutes, watching the windows for any sign of life. According to Grandfather's letter, Margaret Chen had been his contact at the Underground Railroad for Nazi refugees. If she was still alive, if she still lived here, she might be the only person who could verify the truth about the stolen artwork and clear Grandfather's name. Sarah knocked on the front door, her heart hammering. Footsteps approached slowly, and the door opened to reveal a tiny Asian woman in her 80s. Her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Mrs. Chen?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. The woman's eyes narrowed, studying Sarah's face with sharp intelligence. "You have his eyes," she said finally. "Joseph's granddaughter, I presume?" Relief flooded through Sarah. "Yes, I'm Sarah. I found his letter. Come in, quickly." Margaret ushered her inside, glancing nervously at the street. "I've been expecting someone to come eventually. I'm surprised it took this long." The house was cramped but immaculate, filled with the smell of jasmine tea and old books. Margaret led Sarah to a small sitting room where dozens of photographs covered every surface, black and white images of families, children, elderly couples. "Sit," Margaret commanded, settling into a worn armchair. "Tell me what you know." Sarah pulled out the crumpled letter, smoothing it on her lap. "I found this in my grandfather's cabin, and there were paintings hidden in a secret room, stolen Nazi art worth millions. The letter says you can prove he didn't steal them." Margaret's weathered face softened. "Joseph was the most honorable man I ever knew. For 60 years I've watched his reputation be destroyed by people who never understood what we were trying to do." She stood slowly and moved to an old secretary desk, retrieving a wooden box. "These should have been released decades ago, but I was afraid. Afraid of the government, afraid of the wrong people getting hold of them." She opened the box to reveal stacks of documents, photographs, and what looked like official seals. "Your grandfather worked with a network of museum curators, art historians, and collectors across Europe. When the Nazis began looting artwork, we created a secret system to hide the most valuable pieces until they could be returned to their rightful owners after the war." Sarah leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "So he didn't steal them?" "Steal them?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He risked his life to save them. These documents prove that every painting in his possession was officially entrusted to his care by Jewish families fleeing the Holocaust. They gave him the artwork to hide because they knew if they carried it themselves, it would be confiscated or destroyed." She handed Sarah a thick folder. Bills of sale, transfer documents, even letters from the families. Everything authenticated by the International Committee for the Recovery of Stolen Art. "Your grandfather was supposed to return these pieces to the surviving family members after the war, but many of the families didn't survive." Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. Names, dates, detailed descriptions of each painting, all of it legitimate, all of it proving that her grandfather had been protecting priceless cultural artifacts, not stealing them. "Why didn't he ever use these documents to clear his name?" Sarah asked. Margaret's expression darkened. "He tried. In 1951, he approached the authorities with everything. But there were powerful people who had already claimed some of these paintings through other channels, people who had connections in the government, who stood to lose millions if the truth came out. They buried the investigation and destroyed Joseph's reputation to protect their own interests." Who were they? Art dealers, private collectors, even some museum directors. People who acquired lost Nazi artifacts through black market channels and didn't want their legitimacy questioned. Margaret's voice turned bitter. "Your grandfather was blacklisted, his career destroyed. He moved to that mountain cabin to hide from the death threats." Sarah felt the room spinning around her. Death threats? They wanted those paintings, Sarah, and they wanted the documentation destroyed. Joseph spent 40 years looking over his shoulder, afraid that one day they would come for him. Margaret gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength.
Now they might come for you.
Outside, a car door slammed. Margaret froze, her face going pale. "Did anyone follow you here?" she whispered urgently. Before Sarah could answer, heavy footsteps approached the front door, and someone began pounding insistently. Margaret quickly shoved the box of documents into Sarah's arms. "Back door," she hissed. "Take these and run. Don't let them destroy the truth like they destroyed Joseph." The pounding grew louder, more demanding. Sarah clutched the box and ran. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's front porch as Sarah watched Detective Morrison's car disappear down the mountain road. In her arms, Emma stirred against her shoulder, finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. The experimental medication Dr. Chen had provided was working, and Emma's fever had broken during the night. Sarah stepped back inside, closing the door on the chapter of secrets that had nearly consumed them all. The basement door stood open, but the hidden room beyond had been sealed by the FBI team. Soon, federal agents would arrive to completely dismantle her grandfather's operation, removing every trace of the underground laboratory that had funded Emma's treatment. "Mama?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, but it was stronger than it had been in months. "I'm here, sweetheart." Sarah settled into the old rocking chair by the window, the same chair where her grandfather used to read her stories when she was Emma's age. How different those memories seemed now, colored by everything she'd learned. Emma lifted her head, blinking in the soft light. "Are we staying here?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The cabin held so many contradictions now, sanctuary and secret, salvation and scandal. "For a while," she said, "until you're stronger." Through the window, she could see the garden her grandfather had tended, now overgrown, but still showing signs of his careful cultivation. Like everything else about him, it was more complex than she'd originally understood. Some of the plants, she now knew, had been part of his research. Others had simply been grown for beauty, for the peace of nurturing something good in the world. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. The message was brief but filled with hope, FDA fast-tracking approval based on Emma's response. "Other families will have access within months." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the past weeks settling around her. Her grandfather's legacy would be complicated, forever marked by the methods he'd used and the secrets he'd kept. But it would also include Emma's recovery and the recovery of countless other children whose families wouldn't have to make the impossible choices Sarah had faced. Emma shifted in her arms, and Sarah noticed something she'd almost forgotten, her daughter's laugh. It was quiet, prompted by something she'd seen through the window, but it was real and uninhibited in a way that Sarah hadn't heard since before the diagnosis. "What is it, baby?" "There's a bunny." Emma pointed toward the garden. "It's eating Grandpa Great's flowers." Sarah looked where Emma was pointing and smiled despite everything. The small rabbit was indeed helping itself to what remained of her grandfather's flower bed, completely unaware of the human dramas that had unfolded around it. "I think Grandpa Great would have liked that," Sarah said, surprising herself with the truth of it. Despite his flaws, despite the darkness she'd uncovered, she could still remember his gentleness with small creatures, his respect for the natural world that had ultimately driven his research. A car approached on the road below, and Sarah recognized Dr. Chen's sedan. She'd called early that morning, insisting on making the long drive to check on Emma personally. Behind her car, Sarah could see another vehicle, her sister Jessica's familiar blue Honda. The cavalry was arriving, Sarah realized. The people who would help her navigate whatever came next. Emma was already trying to climb down from her lap, eager to greet the visitors with an energy that had been absent for so long. Sarah helped her down, watching as her daughter walked steadily toward the door, no longer the fragile, fading child she'd been just days ago. As the cars parked outside, Sarah took one last look around the cabin's main room. The furniture was still covered in dust sheets. The air still held the mustiness of long abandonment, but somehow the space felt different now. Not haunted by secrets, but simply old and tired and ready for new life. Dr. Chen knocked softly before entering, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine warmth when she saw Emma walking toward her. "How are you feeling, young lady?" she asked, kneeling to Emma's level. "Better," Emma said simply. "Mama says we might stay here for a while." Jessica appeared in the doorway, her face showing relief and exhaustion in equal measure. She'd driven through the night after Sarah's call, dropping everything to be here. "The cavalry has arrived," Jessica announced, echoing Sarah's thoughts. "What do you need?" Sarah looked at her daughter, playing with Dr. Chen, then at her sister, ready to help rebuild whatever came next. Outside, the morning was growing brighter, burning off the mountain mist and revealing the valley below in sharp, clear detail. "Time," Sarah said finally. "Just some time to figure out what comes next." For the first time in months, that felt like something she actually had.